Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. The purpose of The Philosophical Angle is to examine and explicate the nature of concepts and topics being used in current media, and compare its essence with the usage and circumstances and how they're being used. This week, before I get into that, maybe I should introduce my discussant and panelist, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale. He has an MBA from Wharton and an MA from Tufts. He was in the investment banking industry and is currently a venture capitalist. Thanks for being with us, Rick.
Thank you.
With that said, let's start with our topics. The topic this week are 2 statements from different types of philosophies that are out in the current media. First one is on the 20th of February this year. On the CNBC Kudlow TV show, Larry Kudlow said that limited government equals pro-growth. Also in the same week, on the 16th of February, on President Obama's weekly radio address on that Saturday, the president said, quote, "We cannot cut our way to prosperity." These 2 statements seem to be opposing. Which is correct? Let's explore. First, if we have big government and the coming sequester of 80 billion or so is being cut out per year, hoping to make a very small dent in the budget, but nevertheless a start of reducing the size of the government. And this sequester will bring a smaller budget for the government to spend. It is, in essence, limiting government somewhat. And these less expenditures will have an influence on the economy somewhat. It's debatable how much, because the government, I calculate to be about only 15% efficient. That is, if you give the government $1, only about 15% of that dollar comes back into the economy for some purpose, whatever it is. The rest is eaten up by the gigantic bureaucracy. Others have said that less expenditures may bring out higher unemployment. That is, government workers may have to be laid off. The expenditures that the government buys and brings into the economy will not be as great. That will also contribute to a higher unemployment rate. And we can see this presently in the news with President Obama and others forecasting gloom and doom. It's almost as if Chicken Little is out there screaming that the sky is going to fall because because government is being downsized, albeit very slightly. I don't know, we'll check with Rick, but I think it's only around about 1% or so is the sequestration. And so a less budget may also bring a limited government, which may bring less regulations, less laws, less interference, possibly. We'll explore that in a minute. So that's kind of the general outline, and in the news presently. So if big government is now being reduced to just slightly less government, what happens? Well, first of all, the influence of less government on the various various parts of the government will have an influence. For example, the Federal Reserve will have less need to buy the debt of the U.S. Treasury that the Treasury is issuing, and thus it may help produce less inflation, which we predict in the future. So that's something that's good that may come out of a government that is not as big as it once was. Banks and other financial institutions will not have to loan the government or buy their treasuries as much as previously. This money could come to the private sector because the government competes with the private sector for the money that it needs to operate, especially when it's operating at a deficit, which it is. As we all know, the deficit and spending of the government, of the U.S. government, is expansive and huge. And that's pretty much in the news every day about the overspending and the debt. So a less government may help the pressures of the government attracting capital. But another possibility is that less government may produce less laws and regulations. It also may have a beneficial result on the economy due to less spending of the government, allowing the economy to become more efficient. If the government takes less in taxes, or needs less in taxes, that places more money in the private hands, allowing private hands to do with its money as it will. And private companies and private individuals are much more efficient than the government is. As we've said before, it's calculated to be at about 15% efficient. But in the short run, there may be some unemployment because of that 15% coming back into the economy doesn't happen. A small amount may not, because of the smaller government, a smaller amount may not come into the economy. But overall, the government is going to become that less inefficiency because of less government will be taken out and put into the private hands of the private economy. And so in total, we predict that you're going to get less inflation, less private loans to the government, possibly in the future less taxes or the less pressure to raise taxes, which is prevalent in today's political situation. And if you have limited government, you also get limited laws and regulations, which would be a great boon to this economy. To sum it up, all economic transactions are the result of the sacrifice of private individuals with their knowledge and information, with their time and their effort and their materials amidst an atmosphere of risk and opportunity. They employ this to get a reward. This drives every economic transaction throughout the world. And if there is less pressure or interference from the government, from a limited government, this transaction will proliferate and be more successful. So let's go to Rick and ask Rick's thoughts about the two statements that we've seen in the current media. Rick, any thoughts?
Well, we could start by turning the argument on its head. Let's say, for example, that Mr. Obama's right, and there is a magical Keynesian multiplier out there that increases GDP by 50% for every dollar of government expenditure. The obvious question one has to ask is that if you regard his first 4 years in office as one of the great Keynesian experiments of the modern era, why wasn't the growth delivered? We've had deficit spending of on the order of $1 trillion a year. Debt, gross federal debt is up over $16 trillion, up from 11 and change when he took office. And yet all we have to show for this is mediocre GDP growth of between 1 and 2% in most years, unemployment of nearly 8%, and no evidence that there has been any significant multiplier effect. And yet, despite that evidence, the remedy proposed by certainly Mr. Obama and his Democratic allies is to continue doing more of the same, when it appears that approach hasn't worked. So that's sort of Exhibit A. Exhibit B is, the experience of the Reagan administration when, even though federal expenditures continued to rise initially, all right, particularly for defense, and there was deficit spending, it wasn't anything on the order as large, even percentage, especially in percentage terms, as what we've seen under Obama. What he did do was cut taxes, cut regulation, and introduce a number of measures that stimulated business investment. And the results are a matter of history. So Exhibit B then is, call it the anti-Obama solution under Ronald Reagan, which generated one of the longest and most vital economic booms that we've seen in recent American history.
Yeah, you mentioned the Keynesian multiplier. Why doesn't it work? We've seen it tried many times. Is there any time that in the past where the Keynesian multiplier has actually been shown to work, or is it just keeps being tried by the politicians because of their love of spending, of debt spending, and making governments larger?
Well, there is evidence that when the great railroads were built in the 1800s, when the federal highway system was built under Eisenhower, that this paid dividends to the broader economy because it allowed the presence of that infrastructure allowed for the development of other types of businesses, particularly in terms of developing natural resources. But that is a small percentage, and in any federal budget, that type of investment is a small percentage of what the government does. The majority of it takes the form of transfer payments, and the problem with transfer payments is the money has to come from somewhere, namely the taxpayer. And so if you are taking money away from someone to redistribute it to someone else, the person from whom you're taking the money is obviously going to be spending less, even if the person who receives it spends more. So the net effect is negative because the government is a middleman. Resources are wasted on an intermediary role that is unnecessary.
Right, and I calculate that to be about an 85% inefficiency rate. So it certainly wouldn't do to do well. But you know, it's an interesting fact that you brought up about the railroads being conducive to providing an efficiency, even though it's brought forth by expenditures from the U.S. government, and or at least partially. But that's probably, but you know, I think the constitutional founders probably saw that there were some purposes for the government to come forth and make expenditures to allow the private sector to become more efficient. And this may be one of those areas because of their ability for eminent domain and ability to perhaps even effectively produce some projects that the private sector may not be able to do, such that have huge costs, such as traveling to the moon. Not readily apparent why that would produce a positive result on the economy, but the after effect of traveling to the moon had tremendous effect in the number of new products that came out of that research, such as running shoes. The material of running shoes was actually invented in research for the moon project. And I think the railroads probably go into the same category. The founding fathers thought that defense, infrastructure, post office, judicial had some positive benefits, and so the government was provided with that authority to go forth and provide that to the private sector. I think, what do you think? Do you think the railroads fall into the actual, that category of primal purpose provided by the U.S. Constitution?
Well, yes. I mean, a lot of it was privately funded, and a lot of that money came out of Europe, actually. But without the federal involvement in terms of opening up the right-of-way and actually Lincoln's direct involvement in pushing that agenda forward, it certainly wouldn't have occurred as efficiently as it did. And I'm sure there are numerous other examples. You cite the space program, etc. But it doesn't alter the fact that these are, a minor part. And by the way, transfer payments are a growing part of the federal budget, not a shrinking one. And so you could argue that the federal government's structure of spending is becoming less and less efficient over time.
Right, especially if transfer payments are being expanded. These obviously don't have any particular direct benefit, productive benefit, as we see here in our equation. Everything is done for an immediate reward. Whatever reward comes out of a transfer payment is certainly not a direct reward to that, who makes the sacrifice, but some sort of intermediate social reward to make us feel good, perhaps. But it doesn't do anything for the economy, and with an economy as slow as this one is, I think certainly limited government is the way to go.
Well, I mean, you could argue it's worse than that in some instances, because I would suggest that a large percentage of the welfare payments, food stamps, and so on and so forth, actually encourage people not to work and not to invest in businesses and not to be entrepreneurial. And we could even argue that a portion of the school loan budget that we guarantee falls in that category, because kids not being able to find a job are going for opting for additional education or further degrees that they don't necessarily need. So in some instances, these transfer payments actually depress the willingness of the population to work.
So with that in mind, with that said, why do you suppose the Democrats, particularly the Democrats, and probably some Republicans, but particularly the Democrats, and particularly the president, wanting more government expenditures and bridling at the thought of even just a small lessening of the government by this sequester event that's happening? Why do you suppose they are so against and this sequester and so much more for further spending of the government?
Well, if I were a cynical Republican, I might say something like the following. Look, if you're paying people not to work, if you're able to provide largesse to various and sundry interest groups, chances are you're going to be rewarded in the polls, you're going to be rewarded at the voting booth, you're going to create an atmosphere of dependency such that you have a permanent lobbying and support group to call upon, and it seems to have worked for Obama in the prior election. That seems to have been one of the factors that got him elected, and so why wouldn't a politician resort to these same techniques if it's worked for him in the past?
Okay. So let's move from that point. Let's move back to our list here. And let's get your opinion on whether a decreasing expenditures of the government will produce these effects. For example, less inflation. Any thoughts? Could inflation actually subside with less government expenditure?
Well, I think in isolation, yes, but I think our monetary policy, the actions of the Federal Reserve are on such an enormous, unprecedented scale that it just overwhelms any fiscal effect at this point in our financial history. And so I would agree in the absence of that would be the case. But until the Fed stops printing money at the extraordinary rate it is, you won't see the effect of that.
Okay, so perhaps that might come if you had a huge reduction in the size of the government. So we'll leave that as it is. We'll go to loans. Will there be less loans from the banks to the government? Again, that's probably close to your answer is probably tied to the first answer, but let's explore it anyway. Do you think banks would be more now looking to the private sector as opposed to loaning to the government and buying their treasuries?
Well, again, the Federal Reserve is an enormous source of distortion in all this because they are responsible for buying the bulk of newly issued treasuries, as you know. That said, one of the remarkable frustrations of the current economy is that actually, as a small businessman, getting a loan is not easy. And part of that is a natural response on the part of the banks who were burned in the last recession and have been slow to return to what were arguably, relatively lax standards for lending. And so in a relative sense, the recovery in the loan market is taking quite some time as the banks, at least up until this point, as the banks have been in a kind of period of recovery. But going forward, one would expect that as the Fed ultimately winds down its money printing activities, that you're going to see further, or at least more competition for loans between the government and the private sector. It's just that, once again, we've been in this very atypical period in American financial history.
And perhaps with that lack of competition, the interest rates are able to stay low. But
yes.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. Taxes and laws and regulations. Any thoughts there? Will limited government help reduce the pressure for to raise taxes?
Well, we've seen it here locally in the state of Washington. EPA, particularly EPA-related regulations, have driven up the cost of businesses, and most especially in our natural resource businesses, and that obviously includes timber in a big way. So, yeah, for targeted businesses, regulations, and the EPA regulations are the most obvious offenders. The fact that you can't pass certain pollution standards, or the fact that you need all kinds of special permissions to build a plant, and so on and so forth, is an obvious depressant to private investment activity.
Okay. And with these, we hope that the government would be more efficient as it gets smaller. Do you think, we've just got another 30 seconds, do you think there's a correlation between less government, greater efficiency, and private sector benefits?
Well, when we opened, I mentioned that we've tried bigger government, and we see the results all around us, and so I would argue that it's time to try something else, namely more limited government.
Thanks very much for joining us, Rick, and this edition of The Philosophical Angle. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.